Hey everyone, welcome back to another lesson plan. Jack Rest here, and today we're talking crosswind approach and landings. These are very important when the wind's not blowing straight down the runway. That shouldn't be a limiting factor to whether we can go flying or not. So we should know how to compensate for that wind blowing not down the runway, and the changes that we have to make to our normal procedures to be able to compensate for that. Attention is a video of, I'm sure we've all seen them, is a video of airliner jets doing some insane crosswind landings. Very entertaining. And then some go-arounds in there too. It just goes to show like how important crosswind landings are. Crosswind landings are an important skill that they're going to be used every time you fly and all throughout your career. It's not an 8-on pylon that will just go away after your commercial check ride. You're going to have to land a plane when the wind's not blowing down the runway the entire time you're flying airplanes. They do the best to align the runways with the prevailing winds, but it's always, wind can come from 360 degrees. So we should know how to fly for all 360 of those degrees. Jumping right into it, our objective is to be able to recite the steps for a crosswind approach, knowing both methods for how to fly a crosswind and why one's better, and how to maintain that crosswind correction all the way into a landing, and then after the landing, how to compensate for that. So let's just jump in with some definitions. What's a crosswind? Crosswind's the wind blowing across the runway from one direction to another. Wind blowing across from you. Doesn't get much more simple. What's a stable approach? A stable approach, the FAA has many different definitions, but it's really published in AC 9175, I think. Don't quote me on that answer, but there's an AC on stabilized approaches. And the generalized term is a stabilized approach is in which the pilot establishes and maintains the constant glide path towards the predetermined point on the landing runway. So it's 3 degrees to the point of intended landing, 3 degrees to the 1,000 footers, if you know whatever your point is, or your aiming point, and draw a 3-degree line, or have a nice stabilized descent rate, 500 to 700 feet usually, and in a Cessna 172, our final approach would be to 65 knots. Jumping into a traffic pattern, we have the different legs of a traffic pattern. Let me grab a piece of paper so I can draw them real quick. We have one. So we have our runway here, runway 1735, like in Salt Lake. So when you take off, departure leg, make a right-hand turn. That's our crosswind leg. Make another right-hand turn. So this is our first point. It's our downwind point. Downwind point is we just fly parallel the opposite direction, climbing usually to 1,000 feet above the runway. From there, we all know how to fly a normal approach, right? So in a Cessna 172, once you get a beam your point, power comes back, slowing. First notch of flaps, 10 degrees. Once you get the point of intended landing, gets to your 45, you make that base turn, add your second notch of flaps, slow to your base speed. Base is that leg to get you from your downwind to your final approach path. It's perpendicular to your final approach path. And then finally we have that final approach leg where we are longitudinal axis, right, which runs from nose cone to tail cone. That's what you're looking down. That's aligned with the center line of the runway. Your flaps are configured. You're on your final approach speed. You got your nice, constant, stabilized descent. You love to see it. So our normal procedures, we just walk through them. So when crosswind comes, we're trying to fly as normal as an approach as possible. So the only thing we have to compensate is basically which way is the airplane pointing, right? Because we're going to track on the ground differently than what we point the nose at. And so on our downwind leg, we're going to, if we're trying to fly this way, and we're being blown, what we need to do is we need to steer into that a little bit, so we just have a crab angle, just like flying on a cross country or flying, trying to fly straight and level with with a crosswind correction, a crab angle. Our base turn, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, and this is the reason that we practice turns around a point and S turns. It's to know how the wind is going to compensate, how we're going to have to compensate our bank angle for the varying amounts of wind, right? Because if we're trying to turn this way and the wind's coming here, it's going to push us this way, increasing the rate of turn. Or if it's pushing this way, it's going to blow us and extend that turn out. So what we really don't want to do is turn, base final and be super far past the extended center line of the runway, or super in tight from the extended center line of the runway. Extended center line of the runway is just that center line extended out to your airplane. And when we turn final, we want to be right on that. So we have to know, okay, so say, runway's going this way, wind's coming here, blowing this way across the runway. We know that we're probably going to have a little bit of a steeper bank angle to compensate for that wind pushing us. A little bit of a shallower bank angle to compensate for the wind helping us with that turn. We also want to have a nice 90 degree turns for base and final. We don't want to be, here, round it out and be like, oh crap, I got to turn it in a little bit more. So we have to basically do a ground reference maneuver to our base and final legs and keep an eye on our track over the ground and have that perfect 90 degree angle traffic pattern visualized in our head and fly the airplane on that. On final is where we split from a normal approach. And so there's two methods for compensating for crosswind correction. So the main problem, right, is that say we're landing 1-7 and the wind's blowing this way. So if we put the nose right on the center line, we're actually going to go this way, right? And it'll be blown off the runway. There's two ways to compensate for this. The main method that most us GA airplanes use is the slide slip method, also known as the wing low method. The other method is the crab. That's kind of what airlines use because the wing low method, it involves use of the ailerons all the way down the approach path. And on those big airliners, but not that high above the ground, so you don't want to dip the wings. But on our Cessnas, which are high wings, and even our Archers, we have so much room to play with. We don't really have to worry about striking the aileron on the ground. So we'll just touch on the crab method lightly because it's not ideal. It is so we have our crab angle, right? We use it for downwind, we use it for base, and we use it for final. We just hold that crab angle until we come into ground effect. So say this is the ground. And then as we land, we start to kick out that, using the rudder, we start to align that longitudinal axis with the runway, with the center line of the runway. And the reason that that's not ideal is there's an oh shit moment, or oh shit, I gotta kick this out. We don't like oh shit moments. There's a possibility, the main reason that we don't do it is because there's a possibility that we could side load the airplane. If we land on our side, airliners they have big old strong tires that can withstand a lot of force. Ours, if we land side loaded, going this way, facing this way, the tires don't want to roll, just pop them right off. And mechanics love to fix tires, as our mechanic Frank will attest. He loves when you blow a tire. He couldn't have a better attitude about it. So the method that we use is the side slip method. And I was originally taught the crab method, and I still struggle to land a crosswinds. Like, it set me back a while. And so it was only until I broke down the side slip maneuver, and I watched this really good video on how to use side slip, and it explained to me because it's not a natural thing to do. That I finally get the side slip method. And so the side slip method is, we have our slip. We all know slips and skids. Slip is when you bank and you kick it out. And so we have our forward slip to landing, right? To lose altitude is when we open up the airplane to more form drag to cause us to lose more altitude. That's the side slip. I'm sorry, the forward slip. The side slip is when we maintain directional control using the rudder, and we move the airplane using the ailerons. And so what we do is we're turning base, right? We're turning base and we turn final. We set the nose on the center line. So say the camera is, you're standing on the numbers, looking towards the final approach path. And this airplane's coming in, and he starts to move this way. So we know that there's a crosswind from my left, your right, pushing the airplane. So what this pilot's going to do, he's a good pilot. He knows, he says to himself, I'm going to use the side slip method because I'm a good pilot, and it's the best way to land the airplane. I notice that I'm being pushed this way. So you use the ailerons to move the airplane. You use the ailerons to say, all right, so I'm moving this way, so I need to get the airplane back this way. So he just ailerons the airplane to get it back onto the center line. So once he gets back on the center line, he has to keep that in, but he's banked. And so what he has to do to keep that airplane on the center line is he has to add some opposite rudder to keep that nose and that longitudinal axis perfectly parallel with the extended center line of the runway. So we use our ailerons to move the airplane wherever we want to go, and then all we do with our feet is we keep the nose pointed towards the runway. So say we have some bank angle in, and our nose starts to drift a little bit to the left. We can probably either add a little bit of right rudder, but we're stepping on a little bit of left, or add a little bit of right rudder to correct for that, or take a little bit of aileron out. So it's kind of a dance that you have to play between your hands and your feet. But the way I like to think of it as is that we move the airplane to where we want it to go using the ailerons. If we want it to go left, left aileron. If we want it to go right, right aileron. If we're drifting right, of course, that's some left. Drifting left, that's some right. And then all you do with your feet is you keep that nose pointed on the center line. Because we want to land perfectly aligned with the center line of the runway. That's what the AC, or not the ACS. Yeah, the ACS tells us, private, instrument, and commercial. On the landing section of all three, you have to have the nose parallel to the center line of the runway. It's a failable item. And so if we come in super side-loaded, that's not good, being pushed by the wind. So we need to keep that center line aligned with the runway. We do that with our feet. A few advantages to this method is that we know our crab angle, or we know our how much rudder we're going to have before we get even close to the ground. And so that way, so say the wind's blowing really strong, like it's a direct crosswind towards the demonstrated crosswind component of the airplane, 15 knots. It's a 14 knot crosswind component. And we're starting to hit the firewall with our feet, and we're running out of rudder to be able to compensate for that aileron that we need to keep the airplane flying straight. And so we keep, the nose it keeps getting side loaded, or it would be side loaded if we landed. We can say, probably I'm not going to be able to land this airplane. As we know, control surfaces get more ineffective as we slow down, and so I'm going to need more rudder to compensate when I get closer to the ground. So we can say, this is not going to work, I need to go around. So I'm going to just do the go around procedure. This brings us to go arounds. if you have an unstable approach, just as a normal landing, just go around. Go around. There shouldn't be a negative stigma around a go around. It's like it's a get out of jail free card. It is, maybe not a get out, it's a buy one, get one free. No, it's a free card. I don't know. I don't need to, it's not important what the analogy is. We just got to know that it's good. And it's a free chance to try landing again. You get to start over. So don't be afraid to go around. Go rounds are our friend. Because we're slipping the airplane, we might need a little bit more power to compensate for that. So to be able to maintain 65 knots on that final approach, we might need just a bump more power to compensate for that slide slip. So we're side slipping all our way in. We have the nose aligned with the center line, and then as we get to our aim point, right, we're descending to our aim point. As we get to our aim point, our eyes start to come up, focus on the end of the runway, towards the horizon when we start to think about our flare. It's really important that we keep that crosswind correction in. As we slow down, we get to our point, we're probably going to pull power to idle and start to bleed off our airspeed. As our airspeed bleeds off, we're going to have to increase our amount of aileron and rudder to maintain, because as there's less air going over these surfaces, so now the wind's still probably blowing as strong, we just have less authority with our ailerons and our rudder, so we're going to have to increase them. So we'll increase that rudder and aileron, and it's also important, I find myself doing this a lot, in that as my eyes transition to the end of the runway to flare, I start, and you use your peripherals to gauge your position on the runway. And so it's really important that you keep in mind and you stay aware of your position on the runway and your nose's position on that center line to see, okay, if I'm drifting this way, rudder and aileron, right? Because you can still, even if you're a few feet above the, 5-6 feet above the ground, you can still add a touch of aileron and a touch of rudder and move the airplane back to the center line, because center line's what we want. We always want to be on the center line. So we got to stay aware of our position on the runway, because we don't want to land 2/3 over on the side of the runway. If we're landing in Salt Lake on a 150-foot wide runway, that's fine. But if we get over to a 60-foot runway on an uncontrolled field, could be a disaster. So we're coming into flare. Our eyes are at the end of the runway, and we just gotta hold that. We're gonna increase, and then we have that touchdown. Because we have that aileron in, we want our upwind wheel, so the wind's blowing this way to this way. We want this wheel to touch first, followed by this wheel, followed by the main wheel. That's a perfect crosswind landing. Which is different than a normal landing, right? Because in normal landing, you just went goosh, bop. And a crosswind landing went doosh, doosh, bop. That's exactly what it sounds like, too. Those impressions were spot on. So we want that upwind wheel to touch down first, because that's the wing low, that's the lower wing. We're banking into that wind, so boof, boof, pop. And we got to maintain directional control with our feet, so that our feet are still working when we get down to the ground. We always want to maintain directional control with our feet, right? Because that's the main control. Even on the ground, when that nose wheel's touching the ground, we're steering with our feet. We're maintaining directional control, and still using that rudder. Because if we land at high, we still have some elevator effectiveness, and then we also got to use our ailerons to equally load the airplane after landing. Excuse me. When you're on a flight during crosswind, or maybe even during just a normal flight, if you get to enough speed, just try moving the yoke. You can see how the airplane, on a crosswind takeoff, you'll really notice this. If you have this controls neutral, and you take off, you're going to start popping down the runway. If you have a nice crosswind correction in, you'll notice as you add that crosswind correction in, the airplane almost balances out. And you can feel the airplane basically settling on the ground again. Not settling on the ground again, but instead of having all the pressure on this wheel, the airplane will equalize out, and it'll just be much more comfortable and better on the tires and safer. So you got to have that crosswind correction. It may be full aileron deflection, or you probably want to add full aileron deflection. And if it's too much, slowly start to take it out. Also keep in mind braking and aerodynamic braking still goes away, so we're going to add that back pressure when we land. Just some things to keep in mind. Let's not be afraid to go around, like I said. If something doesn't look good, feel good, just go around. It's nature's a racer. It's flying's a racer. A racer of the sky. That's a good way to put it. We also want to be calculating our crosswind component, before every flight. I know in Westminster's binders we have that crosswind calculator chart. Those are really easy to use. You're gonna have to use them to pass the knowledge tests. But you can also Google it, crosswind component calculator. I'm guilty of doing that on several occasions. If you have to do it in flight, when you get the ATIS, do a little rule of thumb. You can even write out like 30 degrees, do this. There's a rule of thumb involving sixth that I don't understand. I'm not a rule of thumb guy sometimes because I mix them up. So don't be afraid to pull out your phone when you're on your way to the airport, or when you're on your way sitting on the ground filling out your pre-flight data, or even on your way back from the airport from the practice area. Figure out what your crosswind component is, because if you can go into that with, okay, this is a 3-knot crosswind component, it's not going to be much. I'm going to be light on my rudder, light on my aileron, or this is a 10-knot crosswind component. I'm going to need to establish my crosswind component, my crosswind correction early, and go from there. One of the big things about crosswind approaches and traffic patterns is the overshooting of the base to final leg. And so if we're turning base here for 1-7, with that wind, we just overshoot final, which can pose some big problems, especially if the wind, because now we're already past the final approach path and the wind's blowing us away from it. So now we kind of have to work double duty to not only maintain center line, but to get it back as well. A little life hack cheat code that your instructor should teach you is to bug your wind. If you have an HSI, or if you are on a G1000 with a buggable heading indicator, just bug the wind so you can always, where's that wind coming from? You can't see the windsock good. The windsock's not, a little get my soapbox here. Use the windsock. It works great. It's probably 3,000 years old, but it works great. It tells you exactly where the wind's coming from and the strength of it. Have you be sure before you land, just notice where the windsock is. It's going to be at the approach end of each runway. Notice the direction and strength of the wind, not only on takeoff, but also on approach and landing. Because that's the best wind information. That the ATIS information that's replenished every hour, that's an hour old. Tower information is centralized throughout the whole airport, which in an airport like Denver, which is 4 times the size of Manhattan, can drastically change. So don't be afraid to use the windsock. Look up, notice that windsock, and say, oh, got to keep it, increase it, decrease it, or say, oh, it died down from what it was. But you can also bug your wind, just give you a rough idea where it is, and you can keep referencing it. I have some trouble remembering numbers sometimes, or mixing them up. So don't be afraid to bug your wind and use that windsock. And the last thing I want to cover here is gusty conditions. So let's say it's, we're landing 170, we got 250, or we're landing 17, so that'd be more like a 130 wind at 20 gust 25. That should not, we do the math, we say, okay, we're on our way back, we're like, all right, this is going to be a strong wind, high crosswind component, so what are we going to do? So not only are we going to fly a normal traffic pattern, but we have to anticipate if the wind's velocity is going to change, that's going to directly correlate to a velocity change in the way that we're moving through the air. So we have to anticipate that. So if we have a potential gust for a higher wind speed, we have to anticipate a higher wind speed coming at us. It means a loss of airspeed, loss of indicated airspeed. And so we have to, a higher is a higher indicated airspeed, but losing that gust is a lower indicated airspeed. And so we have to be able to compensate for that. So the rule of thumb is half the gust factor added to the final approach speed. So in that example, let's do another example, like 15 gust 25. It's a 10 knot gust factor. Half of that would be 5. And so instead of a 65 knot final approach speed, we have a 70 knot final approach speed. That just gives us a little bit more room for buffer, and we also, because of that, when we put our flaps down, they kind of almost act as sails, right? We're putting them down, and we're going to create drag with them. Creating drag creates lift, and allows us to have a higher descent rate at a lower airspeed. But do we really want the lower airspeed? And do we want these, which if we get a big gust of wind, will push us back, right? Act like a big sail. So we may land with 2 notches of flaps, 1 notch of flaps, maybe even no flaps during really gusty conditions. But that's okay because we're going to keep our final approach speed up, which is what you're going to do if you have no flaps. And also just be ready to go around. Don't be afraid to go around. Go-rounds are a friend. All right, thanks for joining me. That's all I had. Crosswind, just to review, crosswinds, we got that side slip or crab method. Don't really need the crab method. That's the oh shit, kick it out at the last moment. We also have the wing low method, otherwise known as the side slip method, which is different than a forward slip. So we move the airplane with the ailerons, and then we maintain that directional longitudinal control with the rudder. Point it right down the runway. Other than that, we just have to have those crab angles throughout the pattern. Airspeed's configuration should be the same, except if it's gusty conditions. Might need a touch more power to compensate for that crab angle. Just the stable approach is the same. We have to have that increase in crossing correction as our airspeed slows down. As we're crossing the threshold, power comes idle. We're starting to bleed off that airspeed, round out into a flare. We got to keep an eye on our position in 3D space as our eyes transition to the horizon to be able to have a nice smooth flare. We got to be aware of that. Not letting the airplane drift. Sorry. I do that way too much. It's all have center line all the way until my flare, and then just I'll end up 30 feet to the side of the center line. Other than that, I think we're good. Thank you guys for joining me. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you guys made it this far. And I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thank you. Bye.